Good evening, guys. I'm just going to switch to Instagram. I'm just waiting for it to come up there. Um, let's see. Here we go. I'm a little bit early tonight because I just needed to set up everything properly. Let me know if you can hear me. I am using a different mic. For people who have been asking me this, I'm a videographer. This is why the footage looks like it does, and I have the gear that I have. It's been a day. I'm going to not do the usual disclaimers except one today. I am highly likely going to get emotional. I watched Nadia's live, and it took everything in me not to break down. I'm currently in Limpopo for work, so I can't be crying my eyes out when I'm with colleagues. I just feel for her on every level, and I'll get to the topic because it's funny that she brought it up in her live as well. But I think many of us can see ourselves in Nadia's experience. And for many of us, we end up in abusive relationships and marriages afterwards because regardless of the fact that we are the scapegoat in our family systems, we still tend to attract abusive people because that's the part that's last to heal, is your attractions. But watching Nadia, I can't imagine what it took to sit there and talk about her family and be confused about everything that's been going on, and being dragged. It's one thing when you go through this in private, but when you have a public persona, it's a completely different experience, because you're abused in public, and people have the gall to assume they know what you're going through without any education, which is why I keep doing these videos, because we do not have permission to abuse other people online without any education. So I am, and I did say in a comment on her page and to everybody involved here that I'm so proud of everyone who's speaking up, because what they don't realize is that they're giving those of us who have never had a voice. They're putting those of us who screamed on the mountaintops and everyone ignored us a place in the world. Nobody understands that position until you're in it. It is the hardest place to be a scapegoat child who has had to deal with an abusive family system. Try to adapt to the system so that you're not completely kicked out, or else you will get kicked out, or you'll be harassed and abused because you don't conform, and then still end up in a relationship where the same thing happens to you and then still have no voice. This happens to far more women than it ever should. So if I do get emotional, I'm sorry, but y'all don't understand what it's like to be harassed and humiliated and used by family that wants to keep the status quo. Y'all don't understand it unless you've been in it. So I am proud of everyone who has come out. Danica still needs to be found, and I'm still on that. But it didn't have to be like this. But for the voices that are able to be heard, I guess God saw that this was the only way. So, let's get into the topic. I wanted to talk about coming from abusive narcissistic families and mental health issues. You know what is the most fascinating thing to me about this particular topic is that many people go to GPs and they describe symptoms that they are having. Much of it is symptoms of depression. And the GP usually can tell when something's up. Okay, depending on how well clued up the GP is. But good GPs can tell that something's wrong. And from what I've heard and experienced, they tend to they ask you first, is everything okay at home? And then they recommend antidepressants. And what's very interesting to me is we are not learning how much mental health and physical health is linked to abusive, narcissistic families. Autoimmune disease, inflammation, depression, high levels of anxiety, self-mutilation thoughts, suicide, all of those things can be attributed to childhood abuse. And I'm not talking about physical abuse even, I'm talking about emotional neglect. I'm talking about being the scapegoat child, who every bad thing that the parent feels shame about is thrown onto that child. All of those things can actually be linked to coming from an abusive family system. And it's always mind-blowing to me that we never connect those dots. In my education, my self-education over the past probably 15 years, I came to discover that the constant bouts of depression were linked to more than just my physicality. And when I did some digging, I realized that the research is actually not made that public, right? We only have access to as much as the doctors will give us privy to. And let me tell you how I came about this, and I'm going to give you a part of the personal story because this is important. You have seen in my images I have 4 children. My eldest one is a C-section baby. My other 3 were natural births. 2 of them were born at home unassisted. And a doctor will jump on my throat and say that was irresponsible. The only reason I gave birth to my daughter at home unassisted was because the gynae told me I will never be able to have a natural birth again, which is a lie. Point blank. I had a VBAC with her at home. It went beautifully. And then I realized it would be a big mistake for me to take everything the doctor said verbatim. Now, I'm not saying don't listen to your doctor. What I'm saying is you need to investigate what's happening in your body and in your mind before you just take all the medications they give you. Because what then has subsequently happened is, in all the people that I've studied, it has turned out that many of the people that are on antidepressants as I sit here right now are actually having depressive episodes and real issues based on childhood trauma they never dealt with. It stores in your body. A book that I recommend to everybody that I speak to is called The Body Keeps Score. Because every single experience you've ever had, it shows up in your body, whether it's mental health and whether it's physical. And to add insult to injury, it's not only the trauma you've experienced. Every single part of trauma that your parents, in particular your mother, has experienced will come through her womb to you. And you will pass it on to your child, which is why I advocate healing so much. We don't realize that we are getting sicker and sicker every day in a world that is filled with the best technology you can ever think of, simply because we are not pointing to the root of our problems. And for the most part, most people don't want to do that work because it's really hard. If you have to sit in a situation and recognize the people who raised you, we can use the excuse they did the best they can, but that they were abusive in their nature. It means we have to face the fact that we may never see those people the same again. And we may not have the same relationships with them again. Because we have to acknowledge who they were in our story. Right? So what I'm going to do is say to everyone, if you have had a mental health challenge, so I'm talking even about things like bipolar, emotional breakdowns, all of those things, have you ever sat and tracked back things from your childhood that you have not been able to deal with? I'm talking about watching abuse in your home, sexual abuse, family sexual abuse, being the child that is emotionally neglected and abused because you were the scapegoat child or the truth teller child who saw everything that was happening. If you were in those situations and you are suffering mentally now, have you ever connected the dots? What I find interesting every day is the more people I speak to, the more I realize less and less people know this. This is vital information because much of the things you're trying to heal through medication or by completely dissociating, and what I mean by dissociation is you're finding a way to shut down centers of yourself and you don't even realize it, because those events are still stored in your body. They don't go away because you pretend they're not there. Your body will experience all of that trauma every day of your life. When people have addictions, every time people are like I come from the deep south of Johannesburg, right? So in Eldorado Park, we know that the drug problem is really huge there. And every time people are going off about, yeah, this one is on drugs, my first question always is, what happened to this person? Because they are numbing for some reason. Someone doesn't get addicted to drugs because they want to. There's always a link to something that happened to them. 98 out of 100 times. Right? But we don't link the two. If you had to sit down and you felt like, because I know I'm gonna separate the demographic here. I'm a colored person. Most colored people don't believe in depression. Yeah, which is still an issue. Most people colored people don't believe in depression because it means we actually have to deal with the issue that's underlining. So we just ignore it. And then we get worse and worse the older we get because we're not actually dealing with what's going on. And then we end up with things like heart disease, high blood pressure, old age mental illnesses, and we don't understand why. The way that the body functions is that the more you ignore a signal, the more the body's going to try and find a way to resolve it. One of the things that people miss, and this is aside from mental health, physicality, is inflammation. Do you know that inflammation is one of the big signs that there's trauma you haven't dealt with? Something that's interesting about parents that parents don't know is that children who have grown up without fathers or have neglectful fathers have a abandonment issue with their dad. They usually end up with inflammation in their lower backs. And let me tell you why that is. The back is your foundation, right? It's the center of your body. It aligns who you are. It's also representative of your identity. Fathers' roles in their children's lives is to give them a sense of identity. So you see children who have safe fathers are generally not the ones who are going to go wayward, right? So you present with issues in the lower back because you have a father wound. There's a book that I'll probably recommend in one of my stories that I suggest everyone get as well, that describes certain ailments and how they are connected to certain things that you need to deal with. It's a beautiful book. Mental health is one of the biggest things. Mental health doesn't happen on its own. Yes, we can say genetics is involved at some degree, but most of them is attributed to something that happened in childhood that we just want to pretend never happened. Because this is the other thing. We all see things very differently, right? We all experience things differently. So you can be two children in the same home. You have a narcissistic parent. This person is not physically abusive, but emotionally neglective. They confuse you, they're manipulative. They choose which child is going to be the scapegoat child and the golden child. And like I said, the scapegoat child is the one they put all the horrible things on because they have to put their shame somewhere and it makes them feel really good to make that child have a miserable existence. And the golden child is the one who's usually revered and loved and given all of this attention, but the child isn't actually emotionally given an emotional availability from this parent. And the scapegoat child is usually the one who carries the burden of the entire family system. So simply because everyone else who the narcissist has chosen in their role tries to keep their role because it has benefited them somehow, right? And then everybody doesn't want to lose that role, so the scapegoat child is the villain in the entire story. Children who come from those homes generally don't recognize that that is happening because they're empaths most of the time. So they are trying to rebuild family relationships, trying to be there, trying to be available, trying to give their family what they need, when the family is literally just using them as a punching bag. And they keep taking it and taking it and taking it. 20, 30 years later, this person has inflammation issues, has to go for tests because they think they might have an autoimmune disease, has had bouts of depression, has had depression during, after, and before pregnancies. Postpartum depression is one of them, has had suicidal thoughts over the years, has dealt with serious issues in their teens, and they could never attribute it to a specific thing. It's because they never realized that even though they never witnessed the narcissistic parent hitting the other, that they were still raised in an abusive system. This is why I keep stressing. It doesn't matter what you think abuse looks like, because we get upset when we see bruises. By the time you have a bruise, the system has been functioning from the beginning. By the time you have a blue eye, you have already been mentally, emotionally, and probably financially abused the entire time. You just didn't know it. Then now we want to make a noise by the time the person's been hit, but we're not actually dealing with the emotional and mental parts that is actually far more damaging. Because during that manipulative process, especially with children, because children fall into these systems unbeknownst to them, right? All victims do, but children are more at risk because they're in the developing stages when they are in these manipulative systems. So their nervous systems are shooting out cortisol and adrenaline literally all of the time. And cortisol is like, it's a, I want to look for the description. So, I lost the name. I will give a better description because I'm feeling a little bit emotional. But so, okay, adrenaline and cortisol is the things that come up. You don't need that shooting up in your system all the time. So you need those things. An example in a video that I'll share later from a lady that did a TEDx Med talk. I love the way that she described this, was that you can be a hunter, right? And a bear comes to you. You need the cortisol and adrenaline to either fight or flight. So cortisol will help you fight. The adrenaline will help you run, right? You need it for that time. But if you live with the bear and the bear comes home every day, your cortisol and adrenaline levels are up all the time. Excess levels of cortisol causes disease. It doesn't only cause disease, it causes certain areas in your brain not to function the way that they need to function, which is why people who come from abusive systems generally suffer with depression. And yeah, you're going to the doctor not knowing what's wrong with you because now you're getting physical symptoms and you've been depressed this whole time and no one is actually telling you, did you come from an abusive home? And this is what an abusive home looks like, because your dad may not have hit your mom, but these things were happening and you'll be like, maybe I did. I don't want to waffle because honestly, my mind is in 1,000 places. But if we don't start addressing the root cause of these mental health issues in a 2024 world that is extremely busy, we're scrolling 24/7 on our phones, which is already not good for our brains because we are giving ourselves dopamine 24/7, which is the happy hormone or the exciting whatever hormone. We are wearing our brains out and we are getting more and more depressed every day because we're doing all of these amazing things and ignoring the root cause for why we're having to zone out on our phones 24/7, why we're experiencing anxiety at the levels that we are, why we're experiencing depression at the levels that we are. One of the things that I feel like is not spoken about in mainstream media or medicine in general is something that I came to experience, not experience, but witness in these sort of situations. ADHD is overdiagnosed, undoubtedly. If you have experience with children who have ADHD and you can recognize the signs, the first question you need to be asking yourself is what happened? Because although there is evidence that it can be genetic, a lot of hyperactive children are hyperactive for a reason. A hyperactive child generally comes from a situation where they've had to be very aware of their surroundings because the bear in their home might decide to act a particular way that day and they need to make sure they are protected. So people who are very aware of their environment, who have hypersensitivities, so they develop things like hypersensitivity to sound, hypersensitivity to flavors, hypersensitivity just to their environment. I have a few ADHD friends that if you walk around with them in the street, this is what they're doing. the whole time, because they have to be hyper aware of the environment in order to keep them protected. Children are not meant to be like that. But hyperactive children generally come from situations, and I'm not saying that the parents who have hyperactive children are abusing them, but something usually has happened that has put that child's brain in a state of fight and flight 24/7, which is exhausting. I'm ADHD, so I can tell you from experience. And all we're doing is giving these kids Ritalin and expecting them to calm down and not dealing with the cause of the issue. We cannot expect our nervous systems to be hyper engaged 24 hours a day without there being repercussions. Our brains and our bodies are not meant to function in a hyper state because we live in dangerous environments. We already live in a country that is extremely unsafe for women in general, aside from abusive relationships. So when we see the depression and suicidal levels going up, we shouldn't be surprised, because we are choosing to negate the fact that a lot of this is attributed to childhood trauma, to issues in childhood that are just not being looked at. I've been recommending to everybody that's been triggered in the last 2 weeks, and I'm going to say this on here, to take time off. Because what everybody doesn't realize they're doing is you can be in a hyper state of awareness all of the time and then be watching these videos back to back because you want to create the same scenario you come from. You have taught, your environment and how you grew up has taught your nervous system and your brain that it needs cortisol to become running all of the time. So you are creating an environment for yourself that is consistently happening, which is why people are so triggered and it's sending them right into depressive states. You need to take time offline because a lot of this is triggering. A lot of this is going to have serious repercussions on you later because you're not realizing that you have adapted so much to that state of being in hyper awareness and your cortisol spiking and your adrenaline spiking, that your mind and your body's trying to find ways to get that hit over and over again. It's a drug. The only way to deal with that drug is to walk yourself back into your past. Right? A lot of what I talk about is stuff that I've done personal research on, plus experience, but a lot of it is personal research. And the more you watch people, have one-on-one conversations with them, it becomes very interesting how you can connect certain mental health issues directly to specific events in these people's lives. If you just sit long enough and ask the right questions. So if that is you, and you haven't taken a look back into your past, or maybe it's been too painful, the question you need to ask yourself is it worth me getting sicker and sicker mentally and physically to just ignore that these things happened, or ignore what happened to me? Or am I going to do the hard thing and be better for me because I don't want to store, especially the woman that's in my womb, for my children to have to deal with? Because undoubtedly you will pass it down through your womb. We talk about family curses. This is exactly what is happening. Trauma alters your DNA. It physically alters the way your body systems function. So if you think you're not going to pass it through your womb, think again. The science is now coming out about this. We can't keep neglecting it. So that is my word on that. I didn't cry. Yay. I might cry after. But this is a topic we need to be talking about in our homes, and the only way the reason I have this live is because I am hoping that everyone who watches it sits on their couch and thinks to themselves, maybe I should be addressing some of this, especially if you don't need your children to walk the same path. It is really unfair to them to hand over trauma that they never asked for. We're already dealing in South Africa right now with systematic trauma that has come from generations and generations before us that haven't dealt. And for those who have had family members live through apartheid in the worst possible states, we are carrying all of that burden with us because they didn't have the education we have now. So in 2024, it's our responsibility to have that education. But I'm hoping that the more we talk about this, that the more we can have workshops, one-on-one conversations, deep, in-depth, meaningful, vulnerable conversations, that more people are going to heal, and we're going to see 20, 30 years from now a massive change in this country in the gender-based violence and family abuse systems numbers. So I'm going to share the TEDx TED talk on my stories right after this. That woman is amazing. It's mind-blowing, that video. You want to watch it. She explained the cortisol thing better than me. I haven't slept for 7 days, so there's that. But thank you guys for joining so much, for all the love that I'm getting from people, from all the support. We're still praying for Danica. We're praying for the patient's family, who are such amazing people. Kathy's such an amazing person. And once again, I am proud of every person who is involved. We all need to share our voice to this until Danica is safely home with her kids, and a family is reunited. Those of us who know what's like to be discarded from these families, we want that for them more than anything. So I love you guys, and I will see you in the next live.